It was supposed to be perfect. Emily Carter and Daniel Thompson had everything: youth, love, ambition. They were that couple everyone envied. Daniel was 35 when they met, and Emily was just 26, full of dreams and energy. He remembered when she first walked into that cafe, where they bumped into each other. She had an infectious smile that seemed to light up the entire room. At first, Daniel didn't believe in love at first sight, but that day, he changed his mind. They didn't waste any time. After 6 months, they were married. Some people said they were rushing it, but Daniel never cared about what others thought. Emily was the one. He knew that, and he made sure she knew it too. Daniel had a steady job as a police officer. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. He was content, and so was Emily. They wanted kids. They didn't talk about it much at first. It just seemed like the natural next step. Emily had always loved children. She talked about how she couldn't wait to be a mother, how she wanted a little boy and a little girl, just like the ones in her favorite stories. Daniel loved that about her, how she could see beauty in the smallest things, how she had so much hope. But as the months passed, nothing happened. It wasn't that they didn't try. They did. They tried everything the doctors suggested, but still no baby. It wasn't anyone's fault, but it felt like a constant, painful reminder that they were failing somehow. The disappointment was unspoken, but it lingered between them. It made everything feel like it was just almost right, like they were always on the edge of something wonderful but couldn't reach it. Then, 2 years in, Emily came to Daniel with those beautiful, hopeful eyes. She was pregnant. They were ecstatic. Daniel remembered holding her close, feeling the pulse of her heart, knowing that life was about to change in the most amazing way. They were going to be parents. It felt like their whole world finally clicked into place. And then the twins came, a boy and a girl. Daniel should have been happier, but there was this feeling in his chest, something unexplainable. Maybe it was the exhaustion from the long hours at the hospital, or maybe it was the overwhelming sense of responsibility that weighed on him when he first held them. But when he looked into their faces, he couldn't help but feel a distance. They didn't look like him. They didn't look like Emily either. Not fully. The boy had her eyes, yes, and the girl had his nose. But the way they held their faces, the way they smiled, it was like looking at strangers. It wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something in their mannerisms, the way they responded to them. Daniel knew it sounded crazy, but it didn't feel right. He didn't tell Emily how he felt, of course. He didn't want to hurt her. She was over the moon, and he wasn't about to be the one to bring doubt into their family. But those little nagging feelings were there, creeping in at the edges of his mind. Why don't they look like us? What if something is wrong? But he shoved those thoughts away, buried them beneath the joy of holding his babies. He had to believe that they were his. That was all he could hold on to. Hey there. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you like karma and justice for cheating wives. Stay until the end to see how life brings revenge. Thank you. The doubts didn't go away, though. Over time, they grew. Daniel tried to push them out of his mind. He told himself he was being paranoid. It was just a phase. New parenthood was stressful. Emily and he were trying to adjust, trying to keep their heads above water. The sleepless nights, the constant demands of the babies, the endless feedings and diaper changes. It was all-consuming, but it wasn't just that. It was something in the way Emily started acting that made his heart twist. She was different. It wasn't immediately obvious, but there were subtle changes. She started spending more time getting ready before she went out, more makeup, more attention to her hair. She'd always been beautiful, but now it felt like she was trying too hard. There was something off about it, something that made him uneasy. She would also disappear for hours during the day. She'd say she was going to run errands or take a walk, but then Daniel would come home to an empty house, No explanation, no sense of urgency. The twins were still babies, barely able to walk or talk, and she was leaving them? At first, Daniel didn't say anything. He thought maybe he was being overprotective. She was a mother now, and mothers need their space too, right? But the more he noticed these changes, the more he began to feel a coldness creeping in between them. It wasn't that she wasn't present physically. She was. But emotionally, it was like she was checked out. She would sit with the babies, but her mind seemed to be somewhere else. They'd talk sometimes about the kids, about their plans. But when Daniel looked into her eyes, he couldn't find the person he married. There was a wall there, an emotional distance that he couldn't break through. And then he began to wonder, what if this wasn't just the stress of parenthood? What if something else was going on? But he refused to admit it. He refused to believe that his wife, the woman he loved, could be anything but devoted. So he buried it all, kept pushing it down. But it hurt. It hurt more than he wanted to admit. Daniel's job kept him on edge. Being a cop in this town meant he saw a lot of things he wished he hadn't. But what started to eat at him wasn't what he saw on the job. It was what he started to see in his own home. He'd leave for work, and Emily would look at him like she was already 1,000 miles away. He wasn't blind. He noticed the way she was dressing more carefully. She spent more time on her hair, her makeup, things she never cared about before. It was like she was getting ready to be someone else. He didn't say anything. He didn't want to sound paranoid, but he knew. The night Jake called, Daniel had been sitting at his desk at the precinct, staring blankly at a stack of unfinished reports. His mind was elsewhere, as it often was these days. The tension at home had been building for months, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. He had tried to convince himself it was just the stress of being a new father, the sleepless nights, the constant demands of the twins. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. When his phone buzzed, he almost didn't answer it. He was tired, both physically and emotionally, and the last thing he wanted was another call about work. But when he saw Jake's name on the screen, he hesitated. Jake wasn't the type to call unless it was important. "Hey, Jake," Daniel said, trying to sound casual. "What's up?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Daniel immediately felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Jake wasn't one to hesitate. "Dan, I hate to do this, man," Jake finally said, his voice low and serious. "But I saw something tonight, and I thought you should know." Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. "What is it?" Another pause. "I was at that bar downtown, the one by the river, and I saw Emily. She was with a guy." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "What do you mean she was with a guy?" "I mean, they were sitting together, Dan. Close. Like, really close. And he's younger. A lot younger." Daniel's mind raced. He tried to picture it. Emily, his Emily, sitting at a bar with some stranger, laughing, smiling, maybe even touching. The thought made him sick. "Are you sure it was her?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, man, I'm sure." I didn't want to believe it either, but it was her. Daniel didn't know what to say. He felt like the ground was crumbling beneath him. This couldn't be happening. Not to him. Not to them. "Dan, I'm sorry," Jake said, his voice filled with genuine regret. "I didn't want to be the one to tell you, but I thought you should know." "Yeah," Daniel managed to say, his voice hollow. "Thanks, Jake." He hung up the phone and sat there in silence, staring at the wall. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, disbelief, betrayal. He wanted to scream, to punch something, to do anything to make the pain go away. But he just sat there, numb. The rest of the night was a blur. He finished his shift on autopilot, barely aware of what he was doing. When he finally got home, the house was dark and quiet. Emily was already in bed, or so he thought. He didn't bother to check. He couldn't face her, not after what Jake had told him. Instead, He sat on the couch in the living room, staring at the wall. His mind kept replaying Jake's words over and over again. She was with a guy, a younger guy. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a friend. Maybe Jake had misunderstood what he saw. But deep down, he knew better. He had seen the changes in Emily over the past few months. The way she dressed, the way she acted, the way she seemed to drift further and further away from him. He thought about the twins, sleeping peacefully in their cribs upstairs. Were they even his? The question had been gnawing at him for months, but he had been too afraid to face it. Now it was all he could think about. He didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emily with that faceless man, laughing, smiling, touching. It was like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. By the time the sun rose, Daniel had made up his mind. He couldn't keep living like this, in this limbo of doubt and suspicion. He had to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. He got up from the couch, his body stiff and aching from the long night. He walked upstairs and stood in the doorway of the bedroom, watching Emily sleep. She looked so peaceful, so innocent, but he knew better now. "Emily," he said, his voice cold and steady. She stirred, blinking sleepily as she sat up. "Daniel? What's wrong? We need to talk." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and final. Emily's face paled as she realized what was happening. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Daniel didn't wait for her to respond. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving her sitting there in stunned silence. The breaking point had come, and there was no turning back. The moment Daniel learned that Emily was seeing someone else, a younger guy, it felt like his entire world collapsed. He didn't want to believe it at first. He wanted to convince himself it was a mistake, just a harmless flirtation, maybe. But Jake, his partner from the precinct, wasn't the type to lie about something like that. He was the most straightforward guy Daniel knew. And when he called that night, Daniel could hear the concern in his voice. "Dan, I hate to say this, man, but I saw Emily. She was at that bar downtown with a guy. Jake said, he's younger than you, man. A lot younger." Daniel hung up before Jake could say more. His heart was pounding in his chest. It felt like he'd been kicked in the stomach. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. But deep down he knew. He tried to focus on work. He tried to let it go, but he couldn't. He had to know. He had to find out the truth, no matter how much it hurt. He didn't want to live in this limbo anymore, caught between denial and suspicion. So he did something he never thought he'd do. He called in a private investigator. His name was Greg. He wasn't a stranger. He was a former colleague from the force who had gone into private work after he left the department. Daniel hated that he was doing this, but at the same time, it felt like the only option. If he didn't know the truth now, he'd go crazy. Greg took the case, and he was thorough. He followed Emily around for days, tracking her every move, gathering evidence. Daniel didn't ask for details right away. Part of him was afraid of what he might hear, but the other part of him needed to know. He needed to hear it from someone who wasn't blinded by love or guilt. The first report Greg sent over confirmed it. Emily had been meeting with the same guy repeatedly. They were going out to dinner, going to parks, hanging out together. He wasn't just some guy she'd met once at a bar. This was an affair, and it had been going on for months. Daniel felt sick. It was as if everything he had built was crumbling in front of him. He didn't even know who he was anymore. The woman he loved, the woman he thought he knew, was with someone else, someone who had everything he didn't. Youth, excitement, energy. How could she betray him like that? How could she betray them? He held on to the report, the photos, the dates, like they were some kind of proof that he wasn't imagining things. But the truth was, he didn't need them to know what was happening. He already knew. When he confronted her, when he finally walked into that house with all the evidence, it was like he was staring at a stranger. Daniel couldn't wait any longer. He had to confront her. He had all the proof, all the evidence he needed to shatter the life they had built. It didn't matter that she might beg, that she might try to explain it away. He needed to hear it from her. He needed her to admit the truth, to look him in the eyes and tell him what she had done. He walked into the living room that evening, feeling the weight of everything in his hands. The investigators' report, the photographs, the evidence. Emily was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, like nothing had changed, like everything was fine. Her face lit up when she saw him, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Daniel, you're home early. How was your day?" she asked, with that fake cheerfulness she had perfected over the past few weeks. He didn't answer her question. He just stared at her. His pulse was racing, and his chest felt tight with rage, but he couldn't hold it in any more. "You've been lying to me, Emily," he said, his voice steady, but he could feel the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. Her eyes flickered. She knew what was coming, and for a second, she hesitated. She put down her phone slowly and looked up at him, her face pale. "What are you talking about?" she asked, trying to keep her voice even. "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice growing louder. "I know about him. I know you've been seeing someone else. You've been meeting him for months. I have proof." He threw the investigator's report on the table, and the paper slid across the surface like a slap in the face. Emily froze. She didn't say anything. She just stared at the photos, at the dates, at the names. Her expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, like she had already rehearsed this. "Daniel, please, you understand," she started, but he cut her off. "No, you don't understand," he shouted, feeling the pain, the betrayal, clawing at his insides. "You've been cheating on me, Emily. You've been sleeping with a younger guy behind my back, and you expect me to just, what, accept it?" Her lips trembled. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. It was like everything had hit her all at once. She knew he wasn't going to let her get away with it. Finally, she whispered, "Daniel, please. I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." He didn't know how to respond to that. The woman he had loved was standing in front of him, pleading with him, and all he could feel was an overwhelming mix of anger, disbelief, and heartbreak. "You want me to believe that?" he asked, his voice low. "You want me to believe that all of this was just a mistake? That you didn't mean for it to happen?" She started to cry then. Real tears, the kind he hadn't seen from her in months. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. He was done. "I want the truth," he said, his voice cold, the anger still simmering beneath the surface. "And I want a paternity test. I need to know if those twins are even mine." The paternity test. Emily agreed to it. She didn't have much of a choice. But even as they sat in that doctor's office, the weight of what Daniel was about to learn pressed down on him. He could barely breathe. He had convinced himself that it was all going to be a mistake, that he was wrong and that the twins were his. But deep down, he already knew. When the results came back, Daniel couldn't bring himself to look at them right away. Emily was beside him, clutching his hand like it was the last thing tethering her to this reality. But the truth was in that envelope, and he knew it was going to shatter everything. He opened it, his hand shaking. He read the words aloud, even though he could barely process them. The DNA test results confirm that Daniel is not the biological father of the twins. It was like someone had ripped the ground out from under him. He felt like he was falling, drowning in a sea of betrayal. How had this happened? How had he not seen it? Emily started sobbing. She begged him for forgiveness. She said she was sorry. She said she never meant for it to get this far. But Daniel didn't care. He didn't want to hear her excuses. The truth was laid out before him, and it burned like acid. The babies weren't his. They never were. And Emily had known all along. In the days that followed, Emily tried to convince Daniel that everything could be fixed. She tried to apologize, to say that it wasn't what it seemed. But every word that came out of her mouth felt like a knife twisting deeper into his heart. She came to him, tearfully begging him to stay, telling him she still loved him, that she didn't want to lose him, that the twins needed him. She promised she would end things with the other guy. She promised that things would go back to normal, that they could make it work. But Daniel couldn't. He couldn't look at her without seeing the lies she had been living. He couldn't pretend like everything was okay when the foundation of their marriage had been ripped apart. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, the words coming out sharper than he meant. "It's not just about the babies, Emily. It's about everything. It's about the trust you broke, the love you destroyed. I can't do this anymore." She cried harder then, pleading with him, trying to convince him that they could rebuild. But he knew, deep down, that was too late. He couldn't come back from this. He couldn't pretend he didn't know the truth now. "Please, Daniel," she begged, "don't leave. Don't leave us." But he had already made his decision. He couldn't stay in this lie. He couldn't live in a house where he wasn't truly wanted, where the love he thought he had was just an illusion. He walked away, and for the first time in a long time, he felt free. Free from the lies, free from the pain. But that freedom came at a terrible cost. He left her. He left them all behind, and he didn't look back. Daniel thought he'd feel relief when he walked away. He thought the weight of it all would lift off his shoulders, and maybe for a moment it did. But as he stood there in the doorway, looking at Emily, her face a mix of desperation and regret, something inside of him cracked. She was crying, calling his name, begging him not to go. "Daniel, please, don't leave us. I love you. We can fix this. Please." Her words were broken, desperate, but they didn't reach him. Not anymore. All he could hear in the silence was the cold truth, the truth that she had betrayed him, the truth that she had shattered everything he believed in. The love they shared had been nothing but facade, and no matter how hard she tried to patch the cracks now, they would never heal. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He wanted to scream, to break something, to do anything that would make the pain go away. But he just stood there, watching her, feeling nothing but numb. "I'm sorry, Emily," he said, his voice hoarse, barely audible. "But I can't do this anymore. I'm done." He wasn't just walking out of that house. He was walking out a life he had built, a life he thought he understood. The twins, the family they had planned together. None of it mattered now. They weren't his. And Emily, the woman he had given everything to, wasn't the person he thought she was. Her eyes filled with tears as she reached out to him. But he stepped back. "Daniel, please don't leave us. The kids need you." "I need you," she cried, her voice breaking. He looked at her one last time, his heart twisting in a way he couldn't describe. The woman he had loved was gone, replaced by someone he didn't recognize. The life there was gone, swallowed up by lies and betrayal. "Goodbye, Emily," he whispered, and he turned away. As he walked out of that house, leaving behind a woman who had once been his everything, he felt the weight of the world pressing against him. He wasn't just leaving her, he was leaving them all. The twins, the life they built together. But he knew there was no turning back. He drove away without looking back. He didn't want to. He couldn't. There was nothing left for him there. And as a mile stretched between him and the house, he felt something inside of him die. It wasn't just the love he had for Emily. It was the man he had been, the man who thought he knew what love was. Because now, all that was left was anger and pain, and an emptiness he couldn't fill. He was gone, and there would be no coming back.